Hello, my name is Vince Bizarre. I'm a lawyer in Rochester, New York, and I wanted to take this time to record some remembrances of a very dear friend of mine, and I think a person who was important in the history of the city of Rochester, and that's Stephen May, who was mayor of the city of Rochester from 1970 to 1974. But prior to that time, he'd been on the city council of Rochester. I met Steve at a meeting of the City Club of Rochester, which was an old club which met on Saturdays with important speakers. It was kind of a intellectual thing. But we were having a party and Steve and I met. And when he found out that I had worked in Washington for Birch Bayh, he was very interested because he had worked for Senator Keating as legislative assistant. Senator Keating from New York and Washington some years before he came back to Rochester. So we talked about Washington experiences, and experiences in the Senate. But like a lot of good leaders, he was looking for people to get involved in what he was doing. So he called me sometime later and asked me to come over to his office. He was sort of the red hot Republican in town. He'd run for city council in 1966 and was elected, and then was well known in the city for his work on housing. He would hold press conferences in front of dilapidated housing, calling for more housing, and was otherwise well known and very well thought of because he was a native son. Anyway, he called me over to his office and explained that he was running again for re-election. In Rochester in those days, we had the city manager form of government under which the city council, led by the mayor, appointed a city manager, but there was a mayor. But it took 5 votes, and the Republicans didn't have 5 votes. So he said, I don't think we're going to win the city this year, but I think I'll probably win, he said. And I thought maybe you'd like to be involved in my campaign, which I agreed to. He put me in charge of, and one of the things he put me in charge of was dealing with a real throwback, the leaders of the captive nations, Latvia, Estonia, and other captive nations, of course, which is not around today, but they were strongly lobbying for their position, and he had a great relationship with him. And I'd go around campaigning with him. One of the things I learned early at any kind of campaign, if it was a dinner or a banquet or anything of that sort, where there was food, he would say, you can eat at home, don't eat. So even now, when I go to a meeting and there's a buffet, I think, geez, I should be meeting people rather than eating. But anyway, he explained he got me involved in the campaign. We went around together to campaign stops. And then during the course of the campaign, the Republican county chairman decided that Steve was their strongest asset and had them announce that if there were a council of Republicans, a majority of Republicans on the council, Steve would be mayor. And there were pictures of Steve and the other Republican candidates. And that went over very well. People in the city thought there should be a leader like that. So lo and behold, the election night, the Republicans won 5 seats, and Steve was going to be mayor. It was not exactly what we would call an orderly transfer of power, even though we always advocate for it, because one of the 5 council members had residency problems, and the Democrats immediately seized on that. And if we didn't have that person, then we wouldn't have the majority. So there were a whole bunch of lawsuits involving that residency. So when Steve was being sworn in as mayor, the incumbent, who did not want to leave, and Steve were kind of arm wrestling over the gavel, while another lawyer and I were downstairs preparing orders to show cause and lawsuits to get the Democrats out of the way, which we eventually did. Steve's big push before he was mayor and while he was mayor was housing. He wanted to develop more housing for limited income people in Rochester. So he brought in a director of housing and urban development who was very aggressive about that. So Steve and the director were able to cut the ribbon on a lot of housing groundbreaking. I eventually became, or he called me up and asked me if I wanted to come over at least for a year from my firm, which I was kind of didn't see any great public purpose in what I was doing defending insurance companies. So I thought, sure, I could come over for a year and then leave and then go back to the firm and maybe have my own public clients. So anyway, he said, why don't you come over and go in the law department or be city clerk? Well, I went in the law department, and after about a year and a half, I became corporation counsel. So one of the really fun and memorable aspects of that job was dealing with Steve and what was called the Big Six cities. Mayor John Lindsay of New York realized that he alone for the city of New York would not do well with state government because all three houses of the New York, if you could believe it, were Republican and Rockefeller was governor. So he thought if he had the other cities involved in the Big Six, Lindsay would have stand a better chance for aid. And of course, the Big Six liked it because John Lindsay was a red hot property in the state of New York. We had him up to New York one time and he was walking down Broad Street and cars were stopping to see John Lindsay. He was like a celebrity. So anyway, part of it was Steve and I would fly to New York City and meet with Lindsay and the other four mayors of Albany, Syracuse, Buffalo, and Yonkers. Rochester was the third largest city in the Big Six, and Steve was proud to be mayor of the third largest city in New York. Anyway, we would meet at Historic City Hall, which was really enjoyable because it's such a significant building. I was working on a noise ordinance for the city of Rochester and New York was a leader on that. So Steve brought in their person who was in charge of noise with a meter that measured noise. And I have a great picture of all of us, including Lindsay, gathered around this noise meter. So anyway, we would plan the next trip to Albany to see Rockefeller and also hold a press conference. The other mayors of the cities used more elbows than Steve did, and they knew that for the picture that would run on the front page of the Times, they needed to stand next to Lindsay. Well, Steve was very deferential and would be at the edge, so his picture did not appear as much in the Times, but some. And anyway, it was very significant, I thought, because New York deals on such a large scale. One day, while we were down there, we were scheduled to catch, I think it was something around a 2:00 airplane back to Rochester. In those days, it was Allegheny Airlines, or also referred to as Agony Airlines. Anyway, we were concerned the meeting and the press conference kept going on. And the mayor of Lindsay kept saying, stop worrying, stop worrying. Well, we worried. So finally the press conference was over, and I think it was only about 25 minutes until our plane took off. So then we saw what catching a plane in New York by the mayor was like. They took us out to Lindsay's stretch limo, and Steve was very tall. And so we sat in it, and he was trying to reach the back seat with his legs, which he couldn't, with his feet, which he couldn't. And so we took the limo to a New York police department heliport in lower Manhattan, and I got in the helicopter, flew to the edge of LaGuardia, and were picked up by a Port Authority police car, which with sirens took us to the airplane. And that was their idea of how to catch a airplane. Steve and I, as country boys, thought it was funny. We got on and I heard somebody say, well, I figured that was him. Nobody else would have that. So anyway, I thought that was so significant. I told Peter Taub about it. Peter Taub ran a political gossip column in the Times-Union, which was the evening paper in those days, but it was, and which was well read by all politicians, but that was one of the big things we did, fun we did. Then we would meet in Albany, and we'd meet first, the Big Six, with the mayors and their aides like me. In the mayor's office, Mayor Erastus Corning, who'd been the mayor for decades, in what was also a historic Richardson courthouse, meeting in his office before we went up the hill to meet with Rockefeller. We'd plan the strategy of how to deal with Rockefeller. So we'd after the meeting, walk up the hill to meet with the governor and his staff. And it was very interesting that even though Rockefeller and Lindsay were kind of off the same bowl of goods. I mean, Lindsay didn't have the money Rockefeller did, but they were both very waspy, well-educated people with a big pedigree. So anyway, Rockefeller was kind of dismissive of Lindsay. He'd say, "Well, now, Johnny," kind of dismissing him. But it was great to see the exchange between Rockefeller and Lindsay. Lindsay's legislative assistant was a guy named Richard Brown, who was later became counsel to the governor of New York when the Democrats won, and then was later elected to Supreme Court and was on the appellate division. But his big claim to fame was his longtime career as the Queens district attorney. And he and I became friends. He was a person who had one of the early, this was in the early 70s, when it had an early car phone. It was not built into the car, but it was a portable phone. So he'd call me day or night from the New York Thruway to talk politics, which I, at some points, were an annoyance, but on the other point was the fact that I was talking to somebody driving or riding along in his limo. So our housing program continued, the Big Six continued, but then in 1973, there was an election, and the Republicans lost, and I saw it coming, and I got out a little early, but Steve obviously remained to the end of his term. The next year, he was nominated to run for New York State Controller. There was a long-time incumbent, and nobody expected the Republican to win, but it was an honor for Steve to be asked to run, which he did. I kind of hated when Steve would get a nomination, because I wanted to work with him, but I also figured there'd go another summer, because we'd campaign all summer for the office. He bought, when I first met him, he drove a VW Bug. He was very, very frugal and lived in the basement of a remnant of a big mansion just off East Avenue in Rochester. As mayor, he made $15,000. I think he saved money on that. But anyway, when he was mayor, he then had a big 98 Oldsmobile for 4 years. But by the time he was running for state controller, he didn't really have a car, so he bought a pretty banged up Ford Thunderbird for me, I think, for about $1,000. So he campaigned around the state in my old Thunderbird. And of course, particularly in Rochester, I would campaign with him. And it shows you how people don't really understand a statewide campaign. He knocked himself out, as he always did. When he was mayor, he would go to every possible event. I came down to his office one time, and he was getting ready to go to a meeting of the Emmanuel Kant Society, and I figured, well, there's about 10 people, but didn't matter. He was going. So anyway, when he was running for controller, we were at a dinner in Rochester, and a guy came up and said, well, sure is too bad you weren't here last year. We had a really great dinner. Well, he was in Poughkeepsie or Glens Falls or wherever. It was a statewide campaign, and they didn't understand that. We knew by the time of this campaign, Nixon had resigned in August of '74, and Steve was running in '74. So we knew this was going, and Rockefeller had resigned to become vice president. And so this person, was Malcolm Wilson, who was supposed to be a mastermind of New York politics, was running in place of Rockefeller. And we knew with the Nixon trouble, it was going to be not a good year, and didn't expect Steve to win because there was a longtime Democratic incumbent. So anyway, Steve invited me. We said, we're going to go down and take the results of the election at the Roosevelt Hotel, and why don't you come down? So we did, and of course the storm came early in the evening. We knew that we were going to be swamped, and here were all these Rockefeller aides going back to 1958, looking at the TV, and I thought this is fun and somewhat exciting, but a lot more exciting to have been at the beginning of all this rather than the end. So we took the returns and went back home. Later, Steve ran for state Senate, and another bad year, and didn't make it, but was then appointed secretary or assistant secretary of housing and urban development for the country. It was a presidential appointment in 1980. So that was big of a presidential appointment, and it fit him perfectly because of his interest in housing and urban development. He not only did he do housing, he did urban development. So it was a perfect fit for him, and I think part of the pinnacle of his career. I learned a lot from him, and in addition to the idea of public service. One of the things I didn't mention that I should was in 1973, Steve called me down to his office, terrible look on his face, had the very bad news that Lindsay was leaving the Republican Party to become a Democrat to enhance his chances to be president. But Steve and I were both, because we liked Lindsay, but also Lindsay was a model of a moderate or liberal Republican, which both Steve and I were, and that was a kind of a dramatic day. One of the things I learned, of course, was to be that kind of moderate Republican, which we both believed. And one other thing I learned from him was dealing with the media. Steve was a master at dealing with the media, from press conferences in front of dilapidated housing to any other issue. He was out in front of it, and he got on TV and always had press coverage, and most of the time it was very good. So when I became president of the county bar and then later the state bar, most bar associations thought their idea of a media program was to write an annoying, angry letter to the editor once a year. But I had learned from Steve how to deal with the media, and was able to get good publicity for the bar associations and for lawyers. And they always wondered, they'd ask, how do you know how to do that? And I said, well, I learned it at the hands of the master, Steve May, when he was mayor. But there was it was an exciting period in my life, and it got me going as corporation counsel, which radically changed my career. I didn't go back to Harris Beach for over 20 years later, had my own independent career, and my career in Rochester and the visibility I had with Steve was instrumental in what has been not just a career in defending insurance companies, and I'm very grateful to him.